Guess it helps to add me to the stream. Hello, everybody. This is Chris Weave. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock Central Time, 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I am currently in the Central Time Zone doing Starfleet Tactical from my brother's house, although my brother is not here. My brother is actually off someplace with his wife. He's out of town, so I am here by myself. I do not have Pat with me either. I don't even have Lissa. Because Lissa's got some other stuff she had to work on tonight, so she's off doing her thing. So today was going to be a question and answer session, but there's a few things I want to do first. The first thing is to remind everybody, of course, that I am not speaking for my employer, any employer past or present, and probably not any employer in the future either. So if anybody tells you that I am doing that, then they're not telling you the truth. Hold on just a second. Let me see if I can fix the lighting in here a little bit. I should have spent a little bit more time on that, but I got sidetracked by working on something else. And where is the... See if that's better. I think that's a little better. Let me turn it down a little bit. My apologies. This is all the sort of stuff that they teach you in the high-priced learn how to do television school. They tell you to do all this stuff in advance, and I didn't do any of this stuff in advance. So Olive says, I forgot to ask my employer if there are any bullet points to bring up. So my guess is probably no. Probably no. So I said there are two things I wanted to do. First was to remind everybody that I speak for myself and not my employer. The second thing is I wanted to go back and talk about a few things that I talked about in the last show. I always listen to the shows afterwards, and I realize that there are places where I could have explained something a little bit better, etc., had an illustration. So I'm going to go back and do one particular thing I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about. Stephen Ross says the room seems kind of bare. It's not quite as bare as it seems. It's just that what we're looking at here is the back of my brother's office, and I can't go back much further because I will hit that reasonably expensive map. That's a cloth map that my sister-in-law got from my brother. And so I'm basically sitting at his desk. But the rest of the room is actually chock-a-block full of stuff, like out in front of me. In front of the table, there's a bunch of stuff, and there's stuff over. In fact, let's take a quick look over to the side. So that is not a bare room by any stretch of the imagination. But this is basically where my brother set up camp during COVID. And so, because he's spending a lot of his time working at home. So let's see. So think of your questions about what you want to talk about in terms of anything that you want to ask me. I hope that there's a bunch of stuff about some of the naval stuff I've done recently. But anything else you might have, go ahead and start posting questions in chat, and I'll try to get to them. In the meantime, though, let's do a little bit of slide stuff. Let me turn that off. Let's do a little bit of slide stuff. Okay, so this is the usual, my opinion's not my employer's, not trying to make anybody not like anything that they currently like. Still planning on doing an Exordium book read along. Haven't started rereading the series myself, but that's the plan. Babylon 5, I'm hoping that we'll get to that in July. I have to talk with Pat, but I've just been too busy to just sort of sit and watch television as much as I'd like to. I expect to be here next week. In a couple of weeks, there's a chance that I might miss something. There's one or two things that I might end up doing. A lot of it depends upon, I'm still waiting for doctors to get back in touch with me. Just dropped something, hold on. Still waiting for doctors to get back in touch with me about stuff. And so I'm not really planning any trips more than just a couple of days in advance. Like, for instance, I did this trip because by Thursday, nobody had called and said, we want to do tests on you on Friday. And I figured that if they called on Friday, they would probably, and doctors' offices don't set up tests on Friday. I figure on Friday they'd probably, the earliest they'd be calling about would be Tuesday. And if they called on Friday while I was driving to Des Moines and said we'd like to see you on Tuesday, I could just come back a day early. So I'm maintaining lots of flexibility on this stuff. Let's see. Next slide is, so there's just the Naval Combat Series I've been going through. We'll talk more about that. So this is a slide that you've all seen before. I did a little sidebar in one of the previous talks about destroyers versus destroyer escorts, etc., and how you can tell the difference between them. I bring that up because you may recall that I said that that one of the things that Lautenschlager talks about is the fact that unless you know what to look for, a modern, as of World War I, ship with a fire control capabilities looked pretty much the same as an older ship did. And you really kind of had to know what to look for. And it's much more obvious on these World War II era ships than it was on the earlier stuff. But on the left, we have 2 destroyers. And on the right, we have 2 destroyer escorts. And one of the big differences between them is the fire control stuff. So how can you tell them apart? Well, the answer is the fire control directors that those destroyers have. So they've got turrets up there that are where the fire control people sit, and they rotate just like the other turrets. That black thing sticking out of the side of the turret is one arm of a binocular system. So they're looking through the scope, but it's got 2 wide arms. And because it's doing parallax, the wider those arms, the better that you can define the range. You have to basically it's just like with a binocular. When you get the image correct, when you sort of dial in and everything is clear and fuzzy and you only see one image, or clear and not fuzzy and you only see one image, you can read the range off, and now you've got the range on something. And so which way, and you adjust the turret so that it's pointing in that direction, and that's how you can tell exactly how far something is. So when I talk about fire control, etc., that's what I'm talking about. I specifically talked about on the South Dakota class battleships, you had Spot 1 and 2 and Sky 1 through 4. So that's what I'm talking about here, those red circles. Those two, that tall red circle at the very top, that is Spot 1, right on the center line. And then the one that looks like it but is down and facing aft, that is Spot 2. So those are the main spotting. Those are where they spot the big guns from. And you can see the one, they're both on the center line, so they've got a good view to the sides. They've got a good view fore and aft. Clearly, Spot 1 has a better view forward than Spot 2 does. You wouldn't use Spot 2 if you were shooting forward, but the goal is to be capping the other guy's T. The goal is to be doing a broadside and everybody's shooting to the side. Now, those other 4 that you can see, there's one on either side off the center line, and then the farthest one forward and the farthest one aft. Those are generally used with the 5-inch guns, and they can split them into sectors. I mean, basically, you got 4 controllers, so you could have 4 different sectors. And you may recall, going back to the doctrine, one of the doctrine things I did, like I think it was the Trent Hone thing, they talked about setting it up in 4 sectors that had considerable amount of overlap. And so that's basically what they're talking about. That's how they would do that. You've got 4 different directors, and they would have the 4 different sectors, and they'd be controlling the 5-inch guns when they're firing in anti-aircraft mode. And I think they also probably control the other guns there, but there may be other fire control positions for the anti-aircraft stuff. But they, if you had to in the middle of a battle, if you lost both Spot 1 and Spot 2, by the way, if you lost both Spot 1 and Spot 2, you're not winning, you're losing. But the idea is that you could, if you needed to, you could sort of have those guys take over for the other ones. As far as I know, they were capable of doing that. I believe I read that somewhere. So that's what I'm talking about when I talked about Spot 1 and Spot 2 and what their importance are. And to be honest, when you look at the when you look at Spot 1 and Spot 2, those turrets look substantially different, and that's because those things are seriously armored. They're very armored, and it's just at the top of this armored cone that comes up. The other ones they look like turrets without guns. And they're a lot less armored, but those ones at the top are extremely armored. I've never been inside either one of the spotting ones or one of the sky ones. I've never been inside. The people at the USS North Carolina, when I worked at CNA, I actually exchanged emails with them, and they said that if I sent them a note on company letterhead requesting permission to go up there, they'd take me up there if I ever got down there. That would be close enough to being an official request that they take me up there. Basically, what you do, part of the issue is that you have to climb like a no shit ladder, not just a steep stairway. It's a ladder to get up there. It's like a 30-foot tall ladder, and there, as you might imagine, there's some liability concerns, and they kind of, they want to make sure that somebody signed a piece of paper saying, yeah, I accept responsibility for this. So let's see. I see Delon has joined from wherever he's at. I think he's in like Omaha or Council Bluffs or something like that. Hello, Donnie. Wright just said he sent some pictures from the Alabama. Let's see. I saw the message come in. He must have sent them via text. Let me take a look at them real quick. Nope. They're not via text. Right, tell me how you sent them in so I know where to go look. He probably sent them via Facebook. Let me double check that real quick. Because this is exactly the sort of things that we do. Yep, he sent them via Facebook, it looks like. Okay. All right, so let me share Facebook Messenger. Got it. Window. Okay. So there's the first. Ooh. That looks like it must be from the bridge of the Alabama. So, right, tell me if that's from the bridge. Neither one of those is the USS Alabama. You can't fool me. That does, however, look like an F-15. Right, is that the car that we went out to dinner in when I was down there? I can't remember if that's the car or not. But that's certainly a sweet looking car. That also is not the USS Alabama. Okay. Oh, you know what? It looks like. All right. Sorry, there was more pictures here. Oh, yeah, that's a great photo. Okay, so that looks like that is. My guess is that is aft, and what we're looking at, no, because I don't see the funnel. That looks like that's either spot 1 or spot 2. It's not high enough up to be spot 1, and I think I see spot 1 on the right-hand side to the right of that mast. I think that's spot 1 up there. So that must be spot 2 looking forward, and I'm just not seeing the funnel because the funnel is, I don't know why I'm not seeing the funnel there. Yeah, because you see on the right-hand side, you can see one of the other turrets. Those are radars that are above those things, right? So those are primitive radars. So we see a 5-inch gun on the very far side on the lower right-hand corner, and right above it, we see one of the fire directors for it. And then at the very top, we can see the binocular optical thing for spot 1, and then up close we see spot 2. Let's see. Okay. All right. It's Let me go back here and take a look. That is a screw, and yep, you can see on this photo, you can see there's one director showing, and that is forward. Yeah, we're on the port side. That's the forward director, secondary director. And there we can see that must be aft. Yep, that's aft. Looking forward, you can see the spot one, the arms sticking out on the side. Then you can see spot two closer. And I think that's it for the images. All right, so I'm going to go back to this, and okay, so let's see. It is above the armored bridge. I'm going to go backwards on these, take a quick look. Okay, so first question from TJ. A what if question. If the BB-65 Ski Mate, the 33 knot Montana, had been built, do I think they would have been preserved with the Iowas or in place of the Iowas or not at all? That's actually, that's tough to say. That hull form, they might have decided to convert it into something else. There's always talk about that stuff. There was lots of talk about converting, like they talked about converting the Alaskas. They talked about converting, this one or that. In the case of the Montana hull form, they did actually use that hull form. That hull form was the basis for the Forrestal class aircraft carriers, and they that led to an interesting situation that somebody on a mailing list I'm on talked about. This is probably 20 years ago now, or 15 at least. When he was a kid, he sent a note off to the David Taylor Model Basin asking if they could send him any drawings they had of the stuff they had in the Model Basin. And he was specifically looking for drawings of the Montana. And he ended up getting a visit, this like 12, 13, 14-year-old kid ends up getting a visit from the FBI, because what this kid didn't know was that the Montana was the hull form that they used as the basis for those aircraft carriers. And as a result of that, the FBI was very, very curious about why somebody would be asking for drawings of it. And he said, no, I'm just trying to, I want to scratch build the model. I'm not, it's, not a Russian agent. I'm a kid. But that was sort of interesting. I don't know. I mean, if they were indeed really 33 knots, my guess is they probably would have kept them, everything else being equal. They might not have kept the Iowas. Now, the Iowas were really pretty good ships. They decided they didn't need more than 4 battleships. The South Dakotas, the North Carolinas were a little light on armor, and they didn't have quite as good a gun. And so, they weren't quite satisfied with the North Carolina design. So North Carolina and Washington were a 2-ship class, and then they went on to the South Dakotas because they wanted more armor. They gave them more armor, but they essentially did it by taking the North Carolina design and scrunching it down. They kept it approximately the same displacement, the same mass. They scrunched it down and made the armor a lot thicker. And you can sort of think of the Iowa as, okay, the South Dakota sort of defined the thickness of the armor. Now we're going to make a ship that's bigger so that we can so it's not as cramped as the South Dakotas were. We're going to make a non-cramped version of that, and we're going to make it but armored to that scheme. The Iowas are really, really seriously good battleships, but they're not perfect. They have a tendency to be kind of wet. they take a lot of water over the bow in rough seas. They're kind of famous for that. They've got other issues here and there. They're really seriously cool ships, seriously fantastic ships, but they're not perfect. If the Montanas were better, they probably would have ended up keeping them. Let's see. Okay, let's see. There's all sorts of comments from Wright about specifics on the various photos, but I'm way past those, so it'd be hard to link them up. But at some point, maybe maybe at some point we need to put together a slideshow. And so Wright points out that in terms of which ships they saved for museums, it really sort of depended upon how much the state wanted to do with it. At one point, they were talking about trying to drag the Iowa up the Mississippi so that they could actually have the Iowa be in Iowa, and yeah, that ended up not happening. The New Jersey is in New Jersey, so they did manage to do that, and the Massachusetts is in Massachusetts. As you can see, some states do a better job than others about this. I mean, they're all it's the ability of the state to sort of pull together and get money. None of these are actually state attractions. It might be a state park, but there's some private group that actually holds it together. You can see what the Texans let happen to the Texas. The Texas is basically sinking pierside right now. And the Alabama the North Carolina was having all sorts of problems there when Commodore Bragg took over North Carolina. I was just reading an article earlier today. He said, there was a whole bunch of compartments that were flooded when he took over. And eventually the Navy sent him a letter that said, you guys either need to fix it up or scrap it, because that's what the agreement said. The agreement said you're not just going to let it fall apart. You either need to fix it up or scrap it. And so they're fixing it up. Okay, Stephen Ross has a question. In Star Trek, there is a bit of a power creep. The Excelsior class was a battleship in Kirk's time, but downgraded to a cruiser in TNG. Is there any examples of this in real navies? So the short answer is yes. The long answer is all the different navies sort of do things differently. In some cases, what you have is that, if the Brits, if I remember correctly, now keep in mind, okay, we're talking about navies, right? So look, I'm going to make some broad brush generalizations that cover at least 700 years of history, or at least 500 years of history. So take that in mind. The Royal Navy, for instance, would say this is a first class cruiser, et cetera. And over time, it's okay, it's no longer a first class. It's been reclassified as a second class cruiser. It's been reclassified as a third class cruiser. So they sort of had that sort of creeping system. They had a similar system when it came to sailing ships in terms of how they would adjust the scaling over time in terms of first rate, second rate, third rate, et cetera. That was sort of a moving window over time. To the best of my knowledge, the U.S. has never done that. But what the U.S. has done, and I talked about this 50 shows ago, what the U.S. has done on occasion is just sort of throw out the old system and come up with a new one. And not so much because the ships got older, but just because they decided, at one point, the Ticonderoga class cruiser was going to be the Ticonderoga class destroyer. And Congress decided that we don't have enough cruisers. And the Navy said, I can fix that. Cross out destroyer, write in cruiser. And that's not as capricious as it sounds, because post World War II, starting in World War II, but sort of moving forward, cruisers had become, with the advent of aircraft to do your scouting for you, cruisers had not ended up being as much about scouting anymore. Cruisers really became about fighting surface actions in situations where you didn't want to send battleships. So sending them in amongst the islands, et cetera, providing some support on the wings. And most importantly, in the second half of the war, providing lots of anti-aircraft guns to protect carriers. So you had the fast battleships and the cruisers as carrier supports for anti-aircraft guns, and then you had destroyers to do ASW and to do torpedo attacks. And so this idea that we're going to take this Aegis DDG, this Aegis destroyer, and redesignate it as a cruiser, while it plays fast and loose with sort of the tonnage, because now you've got basically two ships that are almost exactly the same tonnage, but one's a cruiser and one's a destroyer, when traditionally a cruiser had been a lot bigger than a destroyer. Plays fast and loose with the tonnage rule, but in terms of playing, it was entirely consistent with how we were sort of splitting up our designation. For a while there, cruiser was a word that meant anti-aircraft, and destroyer was a word that meant anti-submarine. So from that standpoint, the U.S. sort of played that game. Not real sure about other navies, but to me, it actually makes a lot of sense under certain constraints. If you're defining things in terms of size, right, you need to think about how you're defining things, right? What makes it a cruiser to begin with? What makes it a battleship to begin with? If you're a cruiser, if in order to be a cruiser, you have to be, you have to have excessive speed, or, this capability or that capability, just simply, redesignating a cruiser, it's like, why do it that way? What Starfleet seems to do, though, Starfleet seems to be more in terms of, first of all, they have a tendency to build multi-mission starships, right? If you go back to the sort of working hypothesis that Andy Presby and Pat and I have, an Explorer is a ship that has high warp capability and a big deflector, which is part of what gives it a high warp capability, because it's going to be going really long distances, and it would really want to go those long distances as fast as possible. And so, Excelsior has a deflector. So from that standpoint, it's not a pure warship, right? It clearly is something that can go off and do the exploratory role. So it kind of makes sense that, if Starfleet has a tendency to sort of group stuff by size and sort of general capabilities, that as the mark moves down, the window shifts, and what used to be the high end becomes the middle. So we'll give it sort of the term we use for the middle. One of the things I find really interesting in the TNG the TNG era, is that every time you see an admiral like coming out to talk to Picard or something like that, he's generally in an Excelsior. Now, realistically, they had Excelsior models laying around. It was kind of easy to sort of say, Excelsior, I'll just plop in an Excelsior. When you see other ships supporting the Enterprise, frequently they're in Excelsiors. And so it's very easy to sort of come up with a narrative in your head that says, okay, flagships have a tendency, they make Excelsiors flagships. They got a buttload of these Excelsiors left in the fleet. They apparently are quite durable. They lasted a long time. They've got a whole bunch of them, so they keep them in place. Why waste a frontline ship on an admiral who's really just, going around showing the flag, going out to visit people, etc.? Better to give him a ship that's still perfectly capable, still can get the job done for what that job is, which is getting admirals places fast. And even though it's an old ship, it's still a fast ship. I'm sure it's been upgraded over all that time, and it was the fastest ship in the fleet when it came out, and it still can book. And that's also a great one to do support for the other ships that are out doing fleet work, right? So you need to run somebody out, you need to do a personal transfer and run somebody out, you run them out in an Excelsior. And so there's probably a captain that's just tooling around supporting the Excelsior. I think TJ is actually the guy who sort of formulated that hypothesis, and I think that works pretty well. So if you hear noise in the background, that's my nephew who just got home. Okay, let's see. I'm scrolling down. Okay, going back to Montana, that particular 33 knot Montana, I don't know about. TJ says that it wasn't the basis of a CV hull. I don't know if he's talking about Montana or in general or that one. To be honest, I haven't sat down and sort of done the comparison on Montana versus Forrestal. I think I have independent confirmation of that from Friedman's book, if I remember correctly. Friedman's illustrated aircraft carriers, U.S. aircraft carriers illustrated design history. I'll have to go double check that though. But I know that it wasn't the basis for Enterprise. Enterprise had very fine lines. Enterprise was built for speed. And the rumor is that Enterprise was the fastest ship in the fleet the day that she entered the fleet, and she was the fastest ship in the fleet the day she left the fleet. The later carriers, and I don't know about the earlier ones, but the later carriers have always been described as they were built more like freighters, in that they were purposefully boxy. They were built to have as much space inside the hull as they could get. Whereas Enterprise was really built for speed, and she could book when she needed to. Okay, so scrolling down. TJ said he's got scans of Friedman and can check that. Wright says that CVN 65 was a stretched Forrestal. I can believe that. It would make the lines a little bit finer. Making her longer would make her faster. One of the things that's kind of interesting, though, if you go back and you look at all those different aircraft carriers, you can notice that Forrestal had the island at the halfway point, right? So there's two elevators on the starboard side. There's two elevators aft and one elevator forward, and then there's an elevator on the port side. And the island was right about midway back. And if you look at the U.S. carriers, World War II-ish era, that was sort of consistent up through Forrestal. Then they started moving. They moved the island back one. They basically swapped the island and one of the two rear elevators, and they had two elevators forward and one aft. They've moved it back even further with the forward. And it's one of those things, it makes a lot of sense if you sort of think about it. If you've got a larger contiguous space so that you can sort of see all that stuff. And Ford actually, if I remember correctly, only has 3 elevators. I don't think it has 4. But they moved it farther back, and you've got the elevators forward. You've got better visibility over the flight line, because you're not having to look over your shoulder backwards. You're not having and look forwards. You don't have to, when you're moving airplanes around, you don't have to bring them out into the main landing area to get around the island. It's from a plane management standpoint, it makes sense to move the island farther back. And if you look at like freighters frequently have the island all the way in the back. Now, freighters are a different story. There's some things that are comparable, some that aren't. From a comparable standpoint, if you're standing in the back, if you're the farther back you are, you're closer to the rear of the ship. And the way ships turn, ships are like, you know, when you go to Home Depot and you get one of those funky flat carts, and the rear wheels turn rather than the front wheels turn. That's basically how ship handling works. The stern is what moves, not the bow. It's not like a car where you're turning the bow wheel. Basically, in a car, you turn the steering wheel, the front wheels turn, and the rest of the car follows the front wheels. That's not how it works in a ship. In a ship, the pivot point, the part that swings out is in back. The pivot point is kind of up front, and the back swings out. So the farther back you are, the better feel you have for what the stern is doing. And since the stern is the part that's going to swing out and hit something and cause problems, that's good. You also have better visibility of everything in front of you. You can see the entire deck in front of you, and so you've got an idea of what's going on. And if you're up high enough, you need to be up high in that situation so that you can see over the nose. And so that's why frequently, if you see container ships, they don't have as many containers up front, because they're trying to give a little bit more visibility over the front of the ship. Now, the other thing that you've got going on in freighters is so basically the people block and the lifeboats and everything else are all sort of in one area, right? That's where you spend the majority of your time is spent in that one area. That's, you're right next to the lifeboats, you're right next to the accommodations, you're right next to medical in case there's a accident of some sort. All of that stuff is there as opposed to being strewn out throughout the ship. Now, not all ships are like that. Ferries have to do a lot of close-in maneuvering, and so ferries end up having a bridge up front. Car carriers generally have the bridge up front, and then they have the accommodations all along the top because they're basically big hollow boxes. And so different ships do it different ways. With the carriers, they're sort of moving the island back. And I joke that the next carrier is going to have the bridge all the way on the stern, and the carrier design after that is going to have a pod that it tows behind the ship. So, okay. Let's see. Okay, Olive, you said that you hadn't thought of Excelsiors, and what do I think? I don't understand the question. If you could please reword the question, I will answer it, or I will give you an answer. Let me put it that way. Wright points out that CVN-65 also had 4 rudders to help in her maneuverability. Yeah, and I'm not sure how many rudders the Nimitzes have. They have at least 2. He also says that he thinks it's unique in carriers, but he may be wrong. I don't remember. That's another reason to pull Friedman off the shelf. So, let's see. So Stephen Ross says in Lower Decks there was a new class based on the Excelsior. Somebody else asked, is the Lower Decks cartoon canon? And the answer is, yeah, as near as we can tell, everybody's considering it canon. It's certainly, I mean, it's an official Star Trek show, and they're actually doing some interesting stuff. They're taking like designs from Star Trek Online and putting them in and canonizing it. In addition to the fact that they put the Spock helmet in, the old Spock helmet toy, which just that right there was enough to make me want, they're clearly very deep in the fandom, very deep in the canon, and they respect both of those, which means it's totally and completely unlike Discovery. So, somebody said Lower Decks isn't canon. I don't know if we've gotten an official word as to whether they consider it canon or not. Now, you may recall from a couple of episodes ago, I talked about how, we've got alpha canon, which is the stuff that shows up, and then beta canon, like officially produced stuff. And then people even talk about gamma canon. I talked about Sierra canon. And Sierra canon is what I consider to be Sierra canon would be anything that J.J. Abrams did, and Discovery and Picard. And Sierra is the phonetic word for S, as in shit. So it's shit canon. So I don't pay any attention to Discovery or J.J. Abrams when it comes to discussing canon, because I think that they did junk, and I'm just not interested in it. And there's so many different flavors of canon out there. It is so inconsistent between the various things. I'm not going to spend any time. You can't make it all fit together. I'm not going to waste any time on stuff that were clearly people that were clearly trying to burn down the house rather than fit into the thing. They were trying to do their own thing. They didn't give a shit about Star Trek, so I ignored it. Yeah, TJ says that he thinks Lower Decks is the best of the new series. I'm not convinced of that. I think maybe the Orville is better Star Trek than Lower Decks, but they're both pretty good, and either one of them is better than both Picard and Discovery combined. Let's see. Stephen Ross says, I saw that the new British carrier has 2 islands. Yes, isn't that a fascinating design? And, one of them is sort of intended primarily as, where they'll do one of them to con the ship, the one up forward to con the ship, the one in the back to sort of manage the flight deck. It potentially has some interesting implications for plane handling on the flight deck. It has also some interesting implications for damage control, because you could lose one island and still have another island to function as your command space. We'll see if that works out. On the one hand, it's less stealthy than having only one island. On the other hand, anytime anybody says aircraft carrier and stealth in the same sentence, you should just start laughing maniacally, because basically aircraft carriers are just all angles and flat sides and gears that stick out and reflect radar waves, et cetera, et cetera. And so at that point, it's like, why even bother trying? I mean, literally, it's like aircraft carriers are about the least stealthy thing that you could possibly make. And so, having two islands from that standpoint doesn't necessarily cause a problem. It might cause a problem just from a plane handling standpoint. And I have absolutely no idea what they're planning on doing for plane handling. One of the things I find very interesting, though, is having done a lot of stuff. So sometimes you'll hear the phrase Five Eyes. The Five Eyes refer to the US, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, right? We have a tendency to, there's a lot of things that we do at the Five Eyes level. And you might think that the way that this would split up is that if you had sort of groupings, that the grouping might be the US on the one hand and all the Commonwealth countries on the other. In my experience, that's actually not the way that it usually ended up working. Despite the fact that, all the Commonwealth countries, their uniforms all look the same. They all take the same oath to the same person. They swap people back and forth between their navies with gay, and other forces with just gay abandon. It's really amazing. You can just sort of say, I'm a Canadian, but I want to go be on the Australian Navy, and nobody bats an eye about that. They do stuff like that all the time. But the thing that that's really kind of weird about it is that when you start sort of, when people start, how people view the world, how you define terms, how you organize things, etc. Along those lines, it's much more likely to see a breakdown where it's Great Britain that's sort of off doing their own thing. Like when they talk about how they think about the infrastructure inside their ships. When we think about the network backbone in the ship, when we call it the backbone, and we got this and we got that, and we our terminology, we got a specific set of terminology that we use, and the other Commonwealth countries generally follow our terminology. You get to the Brits and they're doing their own thing. They just consistently do their own thing. And so whenever they give a briefing, there has to be sort of like okay, when we say this, we mean this, et cetera. They have to have some sort of illustrated thing so we can sort of translate it. And so that happens a lot. The Brits really don't feel beholden to anybody else when it comes to stuff like that. Whereas the smaller powers are much more inclined to just sort of align with us. Now, I will note, for the record, I am not speaking for my employer, past, present, or future, when I say that. That's just my observation. Okay. Let's see. Scrolling back. Somebody asked me, what did I think of the Federation fleet in the first and last episodes of Picard? First, I don't remember there being one in the first episode of Picard. I watched the first season of Picard. I think you mean the first and last episodes of season 1. Yeah, the problem I had with the fleet in the last episode was that it was clearly they were just doing copy paste, and they all sort of zoomed in perfect formation, etc. It just there's a whole bunch of stuff there that struck me as being insanely unrealistic about how the ships were maneuvering, etc. I thought it was it's like they didn't want to put in the effort. I'm sure Kurtzman, whatever his name is, thought it looked great. But, as a general rule, if he thinks it looks good, that's actually probably a pretty good reason to suspect it's not. So, like I said, I don't watch it. I love Star Trek. It's not Star Trek. And at some point I decided it wasn't even worth watching as its own thing. I can tell you exactly when that happened. There were two things that happened. First of all, when Captain Pike is standing behind the blast door and the photon torpedo goes off, first of all, it's like, why not just shoot a phaser or something at it, right? And try to damage the timer or something. Like, what do you got to lose? It's going to detonate. I thought they didn't particularly think the problem through well. And then it turns out blast doors are magic. You can be 10 feet away from a detonating photon torpedo. It blows off the front of the ship, but he's behind a blast door, so that'll stop it. And the other scene was just a quick little thing. There was some phaser or something damaged the top of the ship, and the scene is in a corridor, and the top of the corridor goes away, and the air starts going out, and then a pair of doors just slam over it, because we got random doors every place where there might be a hole, so that the entire ship is consisted of nothing but a skin of doors that can close when they need to. And it's like, at this point, I frankly found it insulting, and I don't watch TV to be insulted. I'd rather just go off and read a book than something like that. So that's what I do. Let's see. Trek Reviewer said season 2. I don't think I've seen anything in season 2 of Picard. I think everything. So to make it clear, what I was just talking about was in Discovery, not in Picard. In Picard, though, there was at the end of season 1, there was the one where all the ships just sort of showed up. I stopped watching after season 1 of Picard and season 2 of Discovery. I just stopped watching both of those. It's just not worth my time. So Wright says, if your carrier has been located by your enemy, your fighter wing isn't doing their job. Depends on how they find you. Fighter wing isn't going to help against a submarine. Fighter wing isn't going to help against a satellite. They may find you that way. Also, carriers are notoriously bad about doing emissions control, right? So, it may have just figured out where you are because somebody was radiating when they shouldn't have been. Or even, they didn't bother to not radiate. The Aegis guys, they have a tendency to kind of want the radar on all the time because they've got this really good radar. And so if Aegis is radiating, if they've made a conscious tactical decision that the best answer is to is to maintain situational awareness, even at the cost that they're spottable, they might just make themselves spottable. And if you go and you look at all the various emitters that you have on the various ships, you will note that on the Nimitz class aircraft carriers, they have an air traffic control radar that is unique to that platform. So you've got 67s and Spy 1s and all this other stuff and all the other surface ships, right? So you can, it's hard to sort of differentiate one from the other. And you have multiples in the carrier strike group, but in the carrier strike group, there's a couple of emitters that they're only on the aircraft carrier. And you look at Wikipedia, right? I'm not telling you anything that the entire world hasn't already figured out. You can learn that from going to Wikipedia. And so, like, if you can type that individual emitter, you can figure out where the carrier is. So hopefully you're turning that stuff off. But to be honest, I spent more time thinking about submarines when I was working for Center for Naval Analysis than I ever did about the air wing stuff. So, I'd have to go and check some stuff. Let's see. Wright points out the ocean is very big. Yes, it is. In fact, you may all recall that I've talked in the past about how there are 4 ways that ships hide. They hide behind the curve of the Earth. They hide through the use of distance and space. They hide behind the interface barrier. They hide by having low observable characteristics, right? So behind the interface barrier is submarines can hide from aircraft that way. Aircraft can hide from submarines. Generally, if you've got some sort of interface barrier, you have to poke a sensor through it to get through it. Even if there's something about your sensor that makes it through, it's going to be seriously degraded in the process. This is the reason why you don't use sonar, active sonar, to find airplanes, right? So behind the curve of the Earth is just that there's a horizon, and once you're over the horizon, you're no longer using optical. You've got to move your sensor to where it can see the thing, and so you can hide behind the horizon and gain some maneuverability, freedom of maneuver behind the horizon. Low observables is, you can make it stealthy. You can put on radar observing materials. You can use shape. If you're a submarine, you can submerge. Those take you out of the area where the sensors can find you, and make you harder to find by a given set of sensors. Or the final one is the ocean's big, so fine-grained targeting sensors are generally like looking through a toilet paper tube. And so, as a general rule, this is why you have multiple different types of sensors that sort of work at multiple resolutions. The ones that are really good about searching large areas generally don't give you targeting grade information. Now, with modern electronics, your digitally steered radar can go into search mode, and then once it detects something, it can sort of lock onto it. Aegis can do stuff that in the old days you'd have to have multiple radars to do. But so yeah, the ocean's big. I didn't want to make that sound like they got the carrier's number. That's not really what I meant. But what I did mean is just that it's carriers are hard to hide, and if they're doing the carrier thing right, if they're doing flight ops, they're even harder to hide. Okay, let's see. I'm having some scrolling 101 issues. Okay, so Olive says there's apparently eye candy in Picard season 2 at the very beginning and very end. Okay, maybe I need to go take a look at that. I had heard that they'd gotten a little bit better about not just doing copy paste. Wright points out anybody who's played Harpoon knows to use your E2Cs to find opposing forces. Yep, airplanes are much better about that sort of stuff. I would love to have gotten a tactical flight in an E2. I never got any tactical flights when I was working for CNA. I got to see stuff ashore. I never got any flights on other than the C2 Greyhound. Would love to have done an E2 flight. Let's see. Yeah, Metal Rogue says it was hard enough controlling emissions on a Gator, much less a flat top. Gators are amphibs. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I've got remarkably little experience with the Gator Navy. I have toured I think it was the Wasp. I toured, one of the LHDs. I toured an LHD, and that when she came to Norfolk, I'm sorry, not Norfolk, Newport, and that was about it. I've never really worked with them otherwise. Spent a lot of time on aircraft carriers, a lot of time on destroyers and cruisers, but no time with the Gator Navy, which is a shame. I would love to have done it. Wright points out he was always a huge fan of LAMP 3s or the S3 or the E2C to do his search work. I love all of those platforms. I love S3s. I discovered a guy I'm working with at work is a former S3 guy. Not only is a former S3 guy, but he went to flight school with a really good friend of mine. Hadn't talked to the friend in like 20 years. So in the parking lot, I called up the friend and said, "Here, you guys talk." But I got to see S3s in action, got to see E2s in action, but never got to actually ride on them, and got to see lamps in action too. So got to watch some helo landings and stuff like that. I remember one time I was on board Carl Vinson, USS Carl Vinson. I think it was my third time at sea on an aircraft carrier, not including the time I just changed planes at that airport. I spent 4 hours on Truman to get to USS Porter from Roosevelt Roads. but it was late at night. We were like 7 days into the exercise. We were way deep into the exercise. And I hadn't watched any flight ops. I had just been busy all the time and just hadn't watched flight ops. And I was crossing through the hangar deck, heading to my rack. They had cleared out a space for us and stuck all the analysts and all the writers who were on board for the exercise in this one space, so we had some privacy. And because we were working 24 hours a day, and most of the ship is not working 24 hours a day, and as a result, during the daylight they're making a lot of noise, and so it's usually better if you can sort of like clear out a space and put all the people that are working 24 hours a day in their own space, so that they can treat it like it's a red light zone, which means stay quiet and let people sleep. And so I was transiting the hangar deck to take the shortcut to get over to where I needed to go, and I heard them say launch the Alert 30 helo, and I thought it was like after right around midnight or shortly after midnight. And it's like, you know what? I haven't watched any flight ops on this ship, so I just got up and just watched them prep the helicopter. And they did one launch, and it was just kind of cool watching them prep the helicopter. Just a nice peaceful night. There's nothing as dark as being at sea. Even being out in the country is not quite the same as being at sea on a moonless night. And it was just, there was light on the flight deck, and then it fades into nothing. It was just a nice, peaceful night. Let's see. It's my opinion of the Nebula class starship. The Nebula class is a really, really interesting thing, and I'd love to see what the requirements document that Starfleet, the Starfleet design got. What the requirements process looked like for that thing. My hypothesis has always been that Starfleet likes to do modular. If you sort of look at the ships, right, there's clear modules there. There's clearly a bunch of designs now. A lot of this is really just that the model makers like to kit bash, right? But there's clearly a design aesthetic there, right? The Miranda's clearly, you can see where the Miranda's derived, and the Miranda's predecessors are derived from their generation of big ships. And the Nebula seems to be another instance of that, where they take sort of they've designed a whole bunch of pieces, parts to make the Galaxies, and the Galaxies are going to be the flagship. You rearrange them a different way, and you can get a Nebula, and we can sort of build this thing. And at some point, it's like, I'd really like to go through and see something. I'd like to see what Rick Sternbach would say is the trade-off between a Nebula and a Galaxy. Why would you? The question in my mind is, why don't you just turn the crank again and do another one? Why would you do something different? There's got to be some reason to do something different. It's cheaper. It uses less resources. It better fits the shipyard that's putting it together for some reason. It's correcting a design flaw that they had before. When the times where I've sort of tried to get an idea about relative size, it really, really looks like a Nebula and a Galaxy class are about the same internal volume, that they've just sort of moved things around, and it isn't so much that they've made it any smaller. And, if you look at the Miranda class, the Miranda is not smaller than the Enterprise in Wrath of Khan. If you sort of do some estimates as to that wedge tail that it has, where the decks extend upwards, and instead of being a circle around in the back, it becomes sort of this trapezoid added on. That trapezoid is easily the size of the secondary hull of the Constitution refits. And so, that's probably a bigger ship than the Enterprise was. So why do you build Enterprises versus building Mirandas? Why do you build those Constitution 2 refits rather than the Mirandas? The conclusion that we came up with in an earlier episode is that the reason why is all comes down to that deflector dish. The Miranda is really a ship designed to operate closer to home. It's designed to have some military punch, right? It's designed to deal with the Klingons, to deal with the Romulans, whatever. It's designed to be more of a warship and more of a patroller behind the expansion wave, the expansion zone, whereas the Enterprise is designed to go out and explore strange new worlds, and it's got a big deflector which gives it the capability of really booking. So make a couple of other assumptions about warp geometry and stuff like that. You can make the argument that one ship is designed for speed, the other ship is designed to be a compact fighting machine and to do support work behind the lines, and that makes total sense to me. I don't quite see that with the Nebula, though. So I remember correctly, the Nebula has a deflector dish, and I'm not. Maybe there's a warp geometry thing there. I haven't seen a good authoritative discussion of that, though. But it's a cool design. See you, Donnie. Yeah, he's probably left already. Let's see. Yeah, right. When I was talking about it being dark out there, he sees it's one of the few places he's seen the Milky Way with his own eyes. Yeah, you have to go to someplace really dark to really appreciate the sky. So Chief Cook says, what about the Sovereign class? I like the Sovereign class. I haven't had spent as much time sort of studying it as I have with some of the others. But in general, I kind of like it. I'd like to read the Sovereign class tech manual. The next gen, the tech manual focusing on the Galaxy class. The Galaxy tech manual has some wonderful stuff in it about the nuts and bolts. And Sternbach did a Sovereign class tech manual. There'd be a lot in there about, why they went to that design. Because if you think about it, during the war with the Cardassians and the Dominion, you see Galaxy classes that there's vague hints there, more specific stuff later, that they took some Galaxy space frames, they left out the classroom in 10 forward and the milk bar and the all the other fancy stuff, left all the families out, and in the space left a bunch of the science lab stuff out, and in the space they had left over from leaving that stuff out, upgunned the shields, put in extra power generators, stuff like that. Maybe put in some troop capability too. When you sort of add all that stuff up, it's like that turns it into a pretty capable, it started off as a capable warship, it became a really capable warship. So why not just turn the crank on that? Why build the Sovereign instead? Why not just, if you think you're going to fight the Dominion, why not just turn the crank on that? Or fight the Borg, why not turn the crank on that? So I'd like to have a better feel for what exactly about that Sovereign class means that they wanted to build that. Now, I will admit, I'm a little fuzzy on timelines on some of this stuff, because I suspect that some of it might be having to do with timelines and some of it might have to do with specific missions. This is one of those instances where I wish Andy Presby or Pat Doyle were here with me, because they've done a lot more thinking about that in the recent past than I have. So Olive says maybe the Nebula fits in smaller facilities. That could be. It makes me wonder if some of that isn't just like, yeah, the problem with the Galaxy is it's just too big to dock at this station, right? It's too big to fit here. It's too big to fit there. If you can make it more compact, it fits better. It does make me wonder what happens to the warp dynamics. So is the Nebula anywhere near as fast as the Galaxy? I can't remember if we have anything that looks like an authoritative source on that. I can see an argument being made that it's not, in which case it sort of makes me wonder, if that's the case, then I can sort of see why you'd have that split, right? It goes back to the Miranda split. You've got one that you can leave behind, one that you can use in sort of more of a military role, not sending it out to the far frontier, not needing the super duper speed to get out to the far frontier. And it works well for the within the zone stuff that the Miranda seem to be designed for. Yes, I would agree. Those war galaxies needed an emergency battle lounge. We all need an emergency battle lounge. Yeah, the Olive also says likely they had been planning on fielding more galaxies before and had them more ready to fit in. I believe that we've seen that in an authoritative source, and that's exactly what was going on. They had galaxies on the slipways, and they sort of said, okay, we're gonna do a conversion on them as they're getting ready to roll out, and that that might very well be the case, that when you look at it, it's like a Sovereign is just way more capable even than a war galaxy. I need to go back and see if we've actually seen specific stats on the war galaxy to get an idea of exactly what that can do. And going back to a much earlier discussion many episodes ago about modularity, and you may recall there was that one Starfleet design that had the modules on the that would sort of plug into the primary hull, and it makes me wonder how modular can you make a galaxy? I mean, can they do it in such a way that you can sort of take big chunks of hull off and put modules in and put the big chunks of hull back on? I don't know. I think Star Trek ships suffer from what we see in many space ships, in that everything looks like the passenger areas of an ocean liner. None of it looks like engineering. When you go into engineering spaces, you get to the point where the decks, etc., fit around the equipment, not the other way around. Everything is designed to fit around the equipment. And so I've often thought that what makes sense to me in spacecraft design is you've got very big pieces of equipment and you've got sort of people capsules nearby. And it's all within a hull with lots of bracing and stuff in between the hull and cable runs and stuff. And so it's not clear to me that it looks like a building, in that you can sort of walk down, at any given, you walk on any given floor, and above you there's another floor that there's a people space right above you and a people space below you, and it's sort of like walls and floors and stuff like that, as opposed to here's a little pod and then there's this giant gap in it that has like a warp core. You see that in some places. The warp core is actually engineering around the warp core is the one place you sort of see that, but I would kind of expect the rest of it to be that way too, right? I would expect phaser emplacements to be like that, and shield generators to be like that as well. Let's see. Okay, scrolling. Yeah, Stephen Ross points out the Nebula has the module on top that can be changed out for mission-specific purposes. We've never gotten a good... We know that it's been changed out. We've seen different ones there. We know that Sternbach, etc., have talked about it being changed out. I don't think we've ever heard anything that explains exactly what criteria... I was going to say criteria they use for a change. That's not really what I meant to say. I don't think we've seen anything that indicates how changeable it is, right? Is it you can build it with one? Is it you can send it into the shipyard and 3 weeks later it's got the new module attached? Or is it we pull into port, we're spending the night in Starbase 12 while they put the new module on, but we're leaving tomorrow because it only takes a day to swap out or something like that, or less, right? Is it just, plug it in? Is it like putting a magazine and a gun? Or is it like building something, right? You can build it modular, right? You get the pieces from the factory. You can build a house you can get modular houses that come from the factory and they bolt them together, but that doesn't mean that you can just swap out modules. I don't think we've ever heard with the Nebula exactly how that works. Wright asked, would I ever consider having Rick Sternbach on the show? Yeah. In fact, I've been meaning to send him a message on Facebook and ask him if he'd like to come and do it. There's a lot of people I'd like to have on the show. And part of it is I don't want to just, say, hey, Bob, thanks for coming on the show. I haven't really done any prep. Let's talk. Right. So if I'm going to have Rick Sternbach on the show, that would actually take a lot of work on my part to have that happen. Not just the getting in contact with him, but in terms of like, okay, I need to prep, right? I don't want to waste his time. I don't want to just, have a conversation with him. I want to go deep into some things, and I want to be I want to be at the point where I've reread everything, etc. Same thing. I want to have John Henry on the show. He writes as Jack Campbell. He does the Lost Fleet series. There's like 15, 20 books in that series now. So I don't necessarily need to reread them all. I've read about a third of them, I think, by this point, because it's been a little bit since I've read any. Don't necessarily need to read them all, but I need to read enough of them that when he comes on, I want to have an in-depth discussion about how command and control works in that universe, what their tactical doctrine looks like, because John's a retired surface warfare officer. If I say composite warfare commander system seems to be what makes sense in your universe, we can have a conversation about that. But it requires some prep work on my part. So, yeah, love to have him on the show. He's already on the list of people I want to talk to. I just kind of need to get my act together. So, yeah, TJ points out the Sovereigns were probably faster. I would agree with that. I think canonically they are, although I'm trying to remember where that source is. Stephen Ross, somebody else I think also asked about the Titan. I love the design for the Titan. I've never read any of the books because I generally avoid Star Trek books because I always feel disappointed in them in the end. But I've spent a lot of time looking at the illustrations of the Titan, and I love that design. Somebody else did sort of a variant of the Titan where they basically flipped it upside down. Love that design too. And so it's a cool ship. I just don't know a whole lot about it. TJ points out the TNG Tech Manual had said there was a first run of 12 space frame, of which 6 were left partially completed. Yeah, I really like the idea of Starfleet saying, look, we got the production line up. We don't necessarily need them right now. It's not finishing them isn't the highest priority for our shipyard, but as long as we got the line up and running, let's crank out a few more space frames, because we'll just let them, hang out in orbit. We'll stick them in the L5 point. We'll just let them hang out in orbit, do minimal maintenance on them to sort of keep them in place. And when we need them, we got them. My sister is a college professor, and she worked at a place that they needed to build a new dorm. So they poured 5 foundations. So, and there's this area, they built 1 dorm, they poured 5 foundations. The next 4, because the expensive part of that was getting the bulldozer out to level off the ground and putting in all the putting in the slab, putting in the plumbing and stuff like that. So they did all that shit. So if they need to act, they're expecting that at some point they'll need to add on to that university. They'll need to build extra dorms. They've already got the floor plan. They'll just build them in place. And so that's what I think Starfleet did in this particular regard. They, turn the crank and get a better price by ordering in bulk, do the things that you need to do, and have the hulls available if you need them for something. And given how fast they were burning through galaxies, even before the Dominion War, it's probably a good thing they had the hulls on hand. Drock did a great discussion recently about the war galaxies being pretty much monsters in Sacrifice of the Angels DS9 episode. Yeah, I saw that series that he did. I think you're talking about the 3-part series that he did with Venom Media. I saw that. So I am a huge fan of Drek Kinefeld. I'm a huge fan of his stuff. I'd love to sit down and have a conversation with him about some of this stuff. I've seen, there's Dr. Alexander Clark. He's done some great stuff too. The one place that the place where I would differentiate what Pat and I do on the show from what they do is a lot of their conversations seem to not spend a whole lot of time talking about things like tactical doctrine behind them, right? They don't talk about operations so much. There's lots of conversations about, well, should you really call this a cruiser? And as you can tell from the conversation tonight, or from the naming and typing conversation we had, 50 episodes ago, or however long it goes, my attitude about that stuff is not, it's not like you look it up in a book and you go, this is a cruiser. You look at Honor Harrington, right? The Manties and the Peeps have different doctrine, and as a result, they classify their ships differently. The Manties classify by mission, the Peeps classify by size. And so, there's ships where the Manties say, we use it like it's a destroyer, so it's a destroyer, despite the fact it's twice as big as anybody else's destroyers. Whereas the Peeps will look at that and say, that's not a destroyer, that's a cruiser, because it's so big, right? And so there's lots of discussion about, should this really be called a battle cruiser? Should this really be this? Should this really be that? And Alexander Clark Dr. Clark did one on a similar thing on some of the ships from Andromeda, Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, and about what they built, they didn't have enough of X and they should have done this, and when dealing with the Magog world ship, they should have reformatted the battle groups in such and such a way. It's like, look, you design your tactics based upon what you've got and what you think the threat is, and there are times where you go to war with inferior tactics because that's what you've practiced. Fight like you train, train like you fight. You don't necessarily throw everything out the window. In fact, there's a really good argument to not throw everything out the window and just sort of make shit up. That you can be more effective doing the wrong thing well than doing the right thing poorly. Especially when this right versus wrong thing is really kind of a, so far this isn't quite working the way we'd like it to. What could we do differently? So if all of your tactics are based upon the idea that you're going to, use speed and maneuver and have individual heavy cruiser battle groups, sticking with Andromeda for now, heavy cruiser battle groups during the thing. I mean, why did they do it that way? Because how often did you ever need anything more than a heavy cruiser battle group? Right? When did you need to actually have a bigger massed force? And do we know that they didn't have plans for that? So I think sometimes there are folks on YouTube that don't sort of look at it from that point of view. I spent a lot of time out with the fleet watching the fleet do stuff. I have a tendency to think of it in terms of like, how hard is it to do this? And what does doctrine bring to you? And what sort of ability does doctrine give you to do stuff? And it's not just about like, well, we called it a heavy cruiser, right? So there's more to it than that. And that's not even getting into the entire, politics of the situation. There are times where ships are called X because politically it's useful to call it that. Okay. All right. TJ took off. I've got to take off too. And I think let's see. Wright made the comment that I have to believe modular construction has to be a part of Starfleet design. I think it clearly is. The model maker, certainly it's part of the model maker's design, but we see that going on. And I've said in the past that I think we can infer some things. Let me rephrase that. I have hypotheses that explain what we've seen, right? I have hypotheses about why X seems to be true versus Y, etc. Like, for instance, I think one of two things is going on with the Ambassador era stuff. Either Starfleet made so much stuff in the era, in like the movie era, the Excelsior era, that they built a few ambassadors, and they didn't end up sticking around much, because you can, if you wanted to replace the Excelsiors in that era of stuff, you would have had to have this huge building program in order to do it. And so there, we're in a situation now where the B-1 bomber is going to go away before the B-52 does. The B-1 came out in the late 70s, early 80s. The B-52 came out in the 50s. But we've got so many B-52s, and they've got, their airframes were built like tanks, and so they've got a lot of life left in them, which is the reason why we do it. It's actually better to upgrade them and have one group of airplanes than to have two. We don't have enough B-1s that we could standardize on B-1s. We're going to have to keep some B-52s around. So as long as you have to keep some B-52s around, why not just preferentially keep B-52s around? I think they did that with the Mirandas. I think they did that with the Excelsiors. I think there were so many of those in the fleet that when it came time to figure out, okay, we need to sort of rationalize the fleet a little bit, the ambassadors are getting a little long in the tooth, that they might very well have just said, we're going to get rid of the ambassadors. That's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis I have is that the ambassadors just aren't anywhere near, and whatever other ships are derived modular from the ambassador construction, I think they're just not around the part of the Federation that we see them in. Like, remember, we see the Enterprise sort of, the Romulans are next to each other and the Klingons, and it's sort of all over here. There's another part of the Federation's kind of over here, and we don't really see a whole lot about it. Sort of like in Lord of the Rings, right? We see Mordor and everything to the west of Mordor. We don't see the stuff on the other side of Mordor, right? The map goes on. Basically, if you want to think of it this way, we've got a map of Europe. Mordor is approximately where Poland is. And probably farther south than that, but approximately where Poland is. We don't see anything. We don't see Russia. We don't see China. We don't see India. We don't see any of that stuff on that map. So it could very well be the case with regard to the ambassadors and the ambassador-derived stuff, that all that stuff is sort of kept in. It's all in this area over here. They assign it all together for the same reason the U.S. Navy assigns all three Seawolf class submarines to the same base. They got three of them. Let's only stockpile parts in one base. It's easier to support them if they're all in one base. So they put them all in one base. So if there are ambassadors around, I think they're all been concentrated in one particular sector of space, and they work that sector of space. And we just don't happen to see it. Or the alternative is there's something about the design they didn't like, or we gotta keep some of the Excelsiors around, so we just kept them all around. Or it could be that the Ambassador was such a small class and there wasn't a whole lot of derived tech from it that we just don't see it. Those are all the hypotheses I've got with regard to that. So, but I do think Starfleet really does practice modular design. They're really into that. Let's see. I see a lot of comments from like Stephen Ross saying Titan seems to be the new Constitution class. Wright said something about maybe having Rick Sternbach talk about the Sovereign class. Roger all. Those are both good ideas. Stephen Ross points out at least one ambassador made it to Wolf 359. Yep. Let's see. Let's go. Metal Rogue said the hard part is no new parts for the B-52 are being made anymore. That's true. I think. I mean, they must have some suppliers for some stuff. I know they're re-engineering those airplanes. the re-engining process is actually kind of interesting. They thought about replacing the 8 engines with 4 airliner style engines, concluded that there's all sorts of stress issues and stuff like that. That would be way hard to do it that way. It was actually easier to go with 8 business jet engines. Another reason why they wanted to go with 8 engines vice 4 is that the rudder on the B-52 has always been its Achilles heel. Early model B-52s had a much smaller rudder. There was a couple of incidents where rudders broke off in flight. Vertical stabilizers broke off in flight. If you look at the vertical stabilizer got bigger, but the rudder itself is still a relatively small part of that airplane. It's not as much of the vertical stabilizer as you would expect on a stabilizer that big. And so they were worried about if they lost an engine, they don't have enough rudder authority to sort of keep the bird under control without putting an undue stress on that rudder. So what they really wanted, the plan is if you lose an engine, you have to compensate with other engines. And so having 8 engines made that easier than having only 4. And so that's why one of the reasons why they decided to go with 8. Replacing those engines, they estimate that it will pay. The original estimate was that it would pay for itself in 3 years, because those old J79s are just maintenance nightmares, and the new engines are between increased efficiency and decreased maintenance, and that basically they would be good without depot level maintenance for the life of the airplane, which is fantastic. I think I saw some stuff indicating that the costs are rising on that. It turns out to be a little bit harder than expected. One of the things I think people don't fully appreciate on this stuff is that a lot of times when the military comes out with stuff, as a general rule, the costs don't go up on the things that they've done before. The military does a lot of stuff that they've never done before, that nobody's ever done before. It's not just like turning the crank on an existing thing. And predicting what the unknown thing is going to be can get hard. Okay. Oh, we've gone way long. Let's see. One last question. This is going to be it. All I've said, I noticed not so many of the top line Starfleet Explorer cruisers end up being the workhorses that endure, but the Excelsior definitely did. I think actually that the Excelsior was kind of viewed as being one of those cruisers too. I mean, it had a big deflector. I think it ended up doing that role as well. Big ship, and you see a lot of different variations of it. So I'd love to be able to see what Starfleet doctrine documents from that era from all eras, about whether they were intentionally building something that was going to be. It's entirely possible that they were intentionally building something that looked like a battleship, but they wanted it to have a strong explorer capability. I mean, if you think about it, it's really fast, big deflector. It meets all the criteria for being an explorer from that standpoint. And it looks like it might be modular enough in terms of what you could put on the back of it that I could easily see a situation where it's like, yeah, we need more science lab capability, so we'll just put some more science labs back there. So, but it definitely is a design that hung around for whatever reason. It must have something going for it. And let's see. One last thing, and then I'm going to take off. Metal Rogue said, yeah, they have to cannibalize parts from the graveyard in Arizona. Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of B-52 sitting out in the desert, and they keep them out there so that they can go and take parts off of them. So for a lot of those parts, there's a bunch of them that are available. So, all right. So with that being said, I think it's time to call it a night. I did a longer show than I thought I was going to end up doing, but thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and I really appreciate the fact that you guys all spend your Saturday night with me. I like doing this, and I appreciate the fact that apparently you guys like doing it too. And let's see, hold on just a second. With that in mind, Live long and prosper, everybody. I'll see you next week. Oh, before I go, I should tell you, I don't know what we're doing next week. I don't know if Pat's going to be in the show or not. I'm probably going to ask TJ if he wants to do his presentation. But I do plan on having a show next week. So live long and prosper, everybody. See you next week.